October 27, 1962. 3 men are about to decide whether humanity survives the night. 2 of them vote yes. 1 votes no, and somehow the no wins. That doesn't make sense. The protocols were clear. 2 out of 3 senior officers could authorize launch. On this submarine, on this day, in these waters, the rules bent. Or maybe they didn't bend at all. Maybe someone just refused to follow them. The submarine was Soviet, diesel-powered, Model B-59, 19 days into a mission that should have been straightforward. Nothing about October 1962 was straightforward. American warships were dropping depth charges. Not the kind designed to sink you, but the kind designed to force you up. Signaling charges, they called them. Practice grenades. When you're inside the hull, 300 feet down, with no communication to Moscow, with temperatures pushing well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with carbon dioxide levels approaching fatal thresholds, you don't know they're signaling charges. You think you're under attack. The captain thought they were under attack. The political officer thought they were under attack. Both of them had the authority to launch. Both of them wanted to launch. 1 nuclear torpedo. That's all it would take. 1 nuclear torpedo with a 10 to 15 kiloton warhead. Hiroshima was also 15 kilotons. There was a third man. His vote shouldn't have mattered. Vasily Arkhipov held the rank of second captain, not the commanding officer, not even second in command in the traditional sense. He was there for a bureaucratic quirk. Brigade Chief of Staff for the entire submarine flotilla. Yes, on this particular boat he was technically an observer. His vote shouldn't have counted, yet it did. Why would a captain listen to a subordinate officer when nuclear war is seconds away? When the Americans are depth-charging your position, when your crew is on the edge of collapse, when every training exercise, every protocol, every instinct says launch, you might think Arkhipov was uniquely qualified, that he had some special insight. And in a way, you'd be right. Not the way you expect. 14 months earlier, Arkhipov was aboard a different submarine, K-19, the Soviet Union's first ballistic missile submarine, brand new, pride of the fleet. They called it Hiroshima as a nickname, which should tell you something about Soviet optimism. July 4, 1961. The reactor cooling system failed. A leak, not a small one. The kind where radiation levels spike so fast the dosimeters max out in seconds, where the reactor compartment becomes a death sentence with an execution date you can almost calculate. 8 men went in to jury-rig a replacement cooling system. They worked in shifts measured in minutes. Longer than that, and you're dead before you reach the hospital. They welded pipes, they pumped water. They saved the submarine, and then they died. All 8, some within weeks, some within a year. Radiation poisoning doesn't negotiate. Arkhipov was the executive officer, second in command. He survived by not going into the reactor room. He watched the men who did. He attended their funerals. He knew exactly what nuclear weapons do before they even detonate. So when Captain Savitsky was screaming about launching, when political officer Meslinikov was agreeing, when the depth charges were shaking the hull, Arkhipov said no. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is why Savitsky listened. Soviet submarine doctrine required unanimous agreement among senior officers for nuclear launch. Not majority, unanimous. Arkhipov wasn't technically a senior officer on this boat. He was brigade staff, an observer. His vote shouldn't have been required, yet Savitsky treated it as required. Was it legal? Was it protocol? Or was it something else? The records are incomplete. Soviet archives aren't known for transparency, especially regarding near-apocalyptic failures. What we know comes from post-Cold War interviews, declassified fragments, the memoirs of survivors, which means we're reconstructing a conversation that took place in a metal tube, underwater, in the dark, in a moment of pure crisis, between men who are now mostly dead. We can work backward from outcomes. The submarine surfaced. That's a fact. It surfaced at night, in the middle of the American blockade, surrounded by warships. The Americans didn't shoot. They identified it, photographed it, let it leave. The submarine limped back to Soviet waters. Arkhipov eventually received the Red Banner, though not until decades later, not with the full story attached. Which raises the question, what did Savitsky think would happen if he launched? He thought World War III had already started. Multiple crew members confirmed it later. They believed the war was underway. They believed Moscow was possibly destroyed. They had no radio contact, no orders, no way to verify anything except the explosions outside the hull. In Soviet doctrine, if nuclear war has started, you launch. You don't wait for orders. You can't wait. The orders might never come. The people giving them might be ash. From Savitsky's perspective, he wasn't starting World War III. He was fighting it. Arkhipov disagreed. Not knowing the war hadn't started, he couldn't know that. He had the same information as Savitsky, the same isolation, the same explosions, the same heat, the same failing carbon dioxide scrubbers, the same crew members collapsing from heat stroke. He disagreed about launching without confirmed orders. That's a strange position. Think about it. If you genuinely believe nuclear war has started, and you have a weapon, and you have targets, why wouldn't you use it? The logic of deterrence breaks down if the war is already happening. Deterrence is about prevention. Once prevention fails, you're just talking about revenge, or survival, or sending a message to whoever's left. Archipov's position only makes sense if he wasn't sure, if he had doubt. Doubt, in that moment, required an enormous tolerance for uncertainty. Here's what he was saying no to protecting his crew. If the Americans were truly attacking, if war had started, then surfacing meant certain death. Staying down meant certain death, too. At least, you'd take some Americans with you. Arkhipov was gambling that the Americans weren't actually attacking, that the depth charges were something else, that there was still time, that the situation could be de-escalated. He had no evidence, just instinct, the willingness to be wrong. The depth charges were indeed signaling charges. The Americans were trying to force Soviet submarines to surface so they could be identified and tracked. Not destroyed, identified. The U.S. Navy had strict orders not to sink Soviet submarines unless fired upon first. Those orders meant nothing to the men inside B-59. They didn't know about them. The Americans, for their part, didn't know the Soviet submarines had nuclear torpedoes. That information was classified so far above their clearance level that the commanders prosecuting the blockade genuinely believed they were dealing with conventional diesel subs. Dangerous, yes. Annoying, certainly. Not existential threats. Both sides were operating with catastrophically incomplete information, which is how these things happen. The Soviet submarines weren't supposed to be anywhere near Cuba. The plan was to establish a submarine base after the missiles were deployed. The Americans discovered the missile sites before they were operational, which meant the submarines arrived into a situation that no longer matched their orders. 4 submarines, 4 nuclear torpedoes, 4 sets of officers making decisions in isolation. B-59 was not the only submarine that considered launching. At least one other captain seriously discussed it with his officers. The difference was that the other boat didn't have Arkhipov aboard, which brings us back to the vote. 3 men, 1 torpedo. The strange arithmetic where 1 no defeats 2 yeses. Soviet submarine command structure was intentionally redundant. The captain commanded the boat. The political officer represented the party and had veto power over military decisions considered politically sensitive. On boats with nuclear weapons, you needed both to agree. That's 2 people, not 3. Arkhipov was there as brigade staff, technically senior to Savitsky in the overall flotilla hierarchy, not in the command chain of this specific boat. His authority was advisory, observational. He could make recommendations. He couldn't give orders. Except Savitsky asked for his opinion, then treated that opinion as a veto. Why? One theory, Savitsky knew Arkhipov from K-19. They had served together during the reactor accident. Savitsky knew Arkhipov's judgment under pressure, knew he didn't panic, knew he'd already faced decisions where the wrong choice meant watching men die slowly. That builds a certain credibility. Another theory, Savitsky wasn't actually certain. The rage, the screaming, the insistence on launching. Maybe that was the sound of a man trying to convince himself. When someone he respected said no, it gave him permission to doubt his own certainty. A third theory, Arkhipov pulled rank, quietly, off the record. Reminded Savitsky that he was brigade chief of staff, that even if this boat surfaced and somehow made it back to Soviet waters, there would be an inquiry, there would be questions. Having the brigade commander on record as opposing the launch might matter in that inquiry. We don't know which theory is correct. Probably some combination. The conversation lasted hours. The conditions were medieval. Men were passing out. The air was toxic. The hull was shaking. This wasn't a calm debate in a conference room. This was 3 men shouting at each other in the dark while the world ended around them. Somehow, Arkhipov convinced them, not just Savitsky, Maslenikov too, the political officer, the man whose entire job was to ensure ideological reliability, who was supposed to be the party's safeguard against officers who might hesitate at the crucial moment. He also backed down. The submarine surfaced late in the evening on October 27th. American warships immediately surrounded it. Searchlights, cameras, sailors lining the rail. The Soviets surfaced in the middle of an aircraft carrier group. The USS Randolph was close enough to read identification numbers. No one shot. The Americans photographed. The Soviets waited. After a tense standoff, the Americans let them leave. Why? The blockade's rules of engagement didn't cover what to do with a surface Soviet submarine that wasn't attacking. Do you board it? Do you escort it out? Do you demand its surrender? The submarine was in international waters. Technically, sort of. The blockade was legally questionable to begin with. Forcing a Soviet submarine to surrender might be the thing that actually starts the war. So they let it go. The submarine recharged its batteries, surfaced, and limped east. It took days. The Americans tracked it the entire way. More photos, more intelligence. No shots fired. B-59 made it back to Soviet waters on November 1st. The missile crisis had ended days earlier, on October 28th. Kennedy and Khrushchev reached an agreement. The Soviets would remove the missiles from Cuba. The Americans would remove missiles from Turkey, quietly months later, with no public acknowledgement. Both sides would pretend they'd won. The submarine crews received no parades, no public recognition. The opposite. The mission was classified as a failure. The submarines were detected. They were forced to surface. They revealed their positions. Some captains faced disciplinary proceedings. The submarine's very existence near Cuba was an embarrassment. Arkhipov received a reprimand for the mission's failure. Not a medal, a reprimand. The Red Banner came later, decades later, after the Soviet Union collapsed, after the archives opened, after Western historians started asking questions, after the survivors started talking. The story didn't become public until a 2002 conference in Havana, 40 years later. By then, most of the principals were dead. Arkhipov had died in 1998, Savitsky in 1999. The conference was meant to bring together American, Soviet, and Cuban participants to finally discuss what actually happened during those 13 days. That's when a former Soviet submarine officer mentioned, almost casually, that they had nuclear torpedoes, that they almost launched. The Americans were stunned. Robert McNamara, who had been Secretary of Defense during the crisis, said they had no idea. He reportedly said they came that close to nuclear war without even knowing it. The submarines weren't even on the radar. The focus had been entirely on the missile sites, the aircraft, the diplomatic channels. The submarines were a sideshow, except they weren't. After the conference, journalists started investigating. Russian veterans started giving interviews. The story spread. Arkhipov went from obscure naval officer to the man who saved the world. Which is accurate, also incomplete. Arkhipov didn't make his decision in a vacuum. He was enabled by Savitsky's willingness to listen, by Maslenikov's eventual agreement, by Soviet naval doctrine that required unanimity, even when that unanimity included people who technically shouldn't have had a vote, by American restraint in not shooting a surface submarine, by Kennedy's earlier decision to use signaling charges instead of live depth charges, by a dozen other factors, any one of which could have gone differently. History loves heroes, individual heroes. The man who stopped the war, the officer who said no. It's cleaner that way. It fits our narrative preferences. We want to believe that in moments of crisis, one person can make the difference. Sometimes they do. Archipov's no mattered. If he had voted yes, the torpedo likely launches. If the torpedo launches, an American carrier group loses a ship. If an American ship is sunk by a nuclear weapon, retaliation follows. Maybe not immediately nuclear. Escalatory. Escalation was the thing everyone feared most. The no only worked in a system that allowed it to work. Savitsky could have ignored him. Maslenikov could have overruled both of them. The Soviet command structure could have been different. The situation could have deteriorated faster. The Americans could have made a different decision. Any variable changes, and the outcome changes. Arkhipov saved the world. He saved it with help, with luck, with a command structure that was just flexible enough, just ambiguous enough, that one man's doubt could outweigh two men's certainty. The alternative is too strange to consider. If the torpedo had launched, if the carrier had been hit, if the war had escalated, would anyone even be around to tell the story? Would there be historians, archives, conferences? Or would the Cuban Missile Crisis be the last crisis? We think of the Cold War as a long stalemate. Decades of tension, yes, stable tension, managed tension. Both sides too rational to actually push the button. October 27, 1962 proves that's not quite true. The button was nearly pushed by rational actors, following doctrine, making reasonable decisions with incomplete information. A critical reason it wasn't pushed is that one person, in one submarine, in one moment, said no. Someone listened. That's the part that still doesn't quite make sense. Not the no itself. The no makes sense once you know about K-19, once you understand Archipov's history, once you see the pattern of a man who had already watched nuclear weapons kill people before they were even used in anger. It's the listening, the fact that Savitsky asked, the fact that he treated an advisory opinion as a binding vote. The fact that in the worst moment of his life, surrounded by explosions, convinced the war had started, responsible for his dying crew, he paused. He consulted. He accepted a no. That's not how we usually imagine nuclear command authority. We imagine buttons and codes and orders. We imagine automaticity. Launch on warning. Launch under attack. We imagine systems designed to be fast, not deliberative. B-59's nuclear authorization protocol included an unexpected human factor: conversation, argument, doubt. The ability for one person to say, "I'm not sure," and have that uncertainty matter. Was that a design feature or a bug? Soviet Naval Command probably saw it as a bug. The whole point of pre-delegated nuclear authority was to ensure fast response if Moscow was destroyed. Debate slows things down. Unanimity creates veto points. From a deterrence perspective, you want your weapons to be credible, which means fast and certain. From a survival perspective, maybe the bug was a feature. Maybe the friction saved everyone. The Americans had similar debates. During the crisis, they considered launching airstrikes against the missile sites. The Joint Chiefs recommended it. The initial plan included nuclear weapons. Not for the missiles themselves. Those could be destroyed conventionally, for other targets. Soviet air bases. Ports. The logic was that if you're going to war with the Soviet Union anyway, you might as well go all the way. Kennedy said no. He wanted the blockade first, diplomacy first. His military advisors thought he was weak, too cautious, missing the window. Kennedy had read The Guns of August, Barbara Tuchman's book about how World War I started through miscalculation and accident. He was terrified of stumbling into World War III, the same way Europe stumbled into World War I. So he chose the slower option, the more ambiguous option, the option that left room for interpretation, for miscommunication, for the Soviets to misunderstand American intentions. Which is exactly what happened. The submarines misunderstood. B-59 thought the war had started. The ambiguity also left room for de-escalation, for Arkhipov to convince Savitsky that maybe, just maybe, they should check first before ending the world. Both leaders, Kennedy and Arkhipov, chose uncertainty over certainty. They chose delay over decisive action. That choice created space. Space for the other side to step back. Space for cooler heads. Space for doubt. Doubt gets a bad reputation. We praise decisiveness, confidence, certainty. Leaders are supposed to make tough calls. Military officers are supposed to follow doctrine. The entire logic of nuclear deterrence is built on certainty, certain destruction in response to certain attack. October 27th suggests that uncertainty might be the only thing that saves us. The willingness to say, "I don't know." The willingness to wait. The willingness to be wrong about whether the war has started. Being wrong in that direction means everyone lives. Archipov's doubt wasn't weakness. It was epistemology. He recognized the limits of his knowledge. He knew what he didn't know. He had the courage to bet everything on his uncertainty being correct. Which brings us back to the opening question. 3 men voting, 3 saying yes, 1 saying no. The no wins. It wins in a system, in that moment, that valued unanimity over speed. It wins when Savitsky asked instead of ordering. It wins through Archipov's credibility earned through previous disasters. It wins as the Americans chose signaling charges over live ammunition. It wins as Kennedy chose blockade over airstrikes. It wins as a dozen variables happened to align in a way that permitted hesitation. Here's the uncomfortable truth. We got lucky. Savitsky could have launched without asking. Arkhipov could have been on a different submarine. The Americans could have used live depth charges. Kennedy could have listened to his generals. Any of those changes, and we're having a very different conversation. Or no conversation at all. The man who saved the world didn't think of himself that way. Arkhipov went back to a quiet naval career. He taught at the Naval Academy. He commanded a submarine squadron. He retired in the 1980s. He never gave interviews. He didn't write memoirs. When Western historians finally found him in the 1990s, he was reluctant to discuss it. Not from classification. By then the Soviet Union was gone, and the classifications were meaningless. From not thinking it was remarkable. He had done his job. He had assessed the situation. He had given his opinion. Savitsky had listened. They had surfaced. They had survived. What was remarkable about that? Everything, as it turns out. Only in retrospect. Only after we learned how close it came. Only after we understood that the nuclear torpedo was ready. That the authorization was in place. That the doctrine permitted launch. That 2 out of 3 officers wanted to proceed. In the moment, Arkhipov was just a man trying to make a decision with insufficient information. He didn't know he was saving the world. He knew he was disagreeing with his captain. He knew he was gambling. He knew that if he was wrong, if the war really had started, then he was condemning his crew to capture or death for nothing. He chose doubt anyway. That's the real lesson. Not that heroes save the world. Not that one man can make a difference. Those things are true. They're not the interesting part. The interesting part is that the hero is the one who admits he doesn't know. The hero is the one who says, wait. The hero is the one who chooses uncertainty in a moment that demands certainty. We built nuclear weapons to be certain. Certain deterrence, certain destruction, certain retaliation. The entire architecture of mutually assured destruction is predicated on certainty. You attack, we respond. Everyone dies, therefore no one attacks. It's game theory. It's mathematics. It's supposed to be clean. B-59 proves it's not clean. It's messy. It's 3 men in a submarine shouting at each other while their crew collapses. It's incomplete information and failed communications and protocols that sort of apply, not quite. It's the gap between doctrine and reality. It's the space where human judgment still matters. In that space, Arkhipov said no. Not from certainty. From uncertainty. From doubt. In that moment, doubt was the only thing preventing certainty from killing everyone. The Cuban Missile Crisis is remembered as a triumph of diplomacy. Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiating, the hotline being established. The treaties that followed. The beginning of détente. All of that is true. The crisis was resolved diplomatically. The diplomacy only worked as B-59 didn't launch. Arkhipov gave diplomacy time to happen. His no bought hours. Those hours became days. Those days became the negotiation. The negotiation became the resolution. If the torpedo had launched on October 27th, Kennedy and Khrushchev wouldn't have had time to negotiate. They would have been reacting, escalating, following their own doctrines. Doctrine, at that point, led one direction. The diplomatic triumph rested on a foundation most people never knew existed. One man's willingness to doubt, another man's willingness to listen to that doubt. That's not a comfortable lesson for a nuclear age. We want our systems to be reliable. We want clear command structures. We want protocols that work. We don't want world survival to depend on whether one captain happens to ask for a second opinion, or whether that second opinion happens to come from someone with the credibility to be taken seriously. That's what happened. The system didn't save us. The system almost killed us. People saved us. Specific people making specific choices in a specific moment with specific relationships that allowed doubt to outweigh certainty. Can we design systems that build that in? That institutionalize doubt? That require conversation before launch? Maybe. Every delay, every veto point, every requirement for consensus makes deterrence less credible. Less credible deterrence might make war more likely. It's the central paradox of nuclear weapons. The more certain your retaliation, the less likely you are to need it. The more certain your retaliation, the more likely you are to launch by accident, by miscommunication, by misunderstanding. You can't solve both problems simultaneously. You can only choose which risk you'd rather take. On October 27, 1962, Vasily Arkhipov chose the risk of being wrong about whether the war had started. He chose the risk of surfacing into enemy guns. He chose the risk of returning home without having fulfilled his mission. He chose the risk of doubt. That risk, as it turns out, was the only safe bet available. Certainty would have killed everyone. Only doubt let us survive. Think about what could have happened that day based on the doctrines in place. Not just the torpedo launch, not just the nuclear explosion, not just the American carrier sinking. Think about everything that would have followed. The chain of events that would have been unstoppable once that first domino fell. The carrier group commander would have had no choice. A nuclear attack on a U.S. vessel means immediate retaliation. Protocol demands it. Strategic logic demands it. Domestic politics demands it. Kennedy would have been pressured, no, forced to respond with overwhelming force. The Joint Chiefs would have gotten their airstrikes, the ones they'd been asking for all along, the ones with nuclear weapons attached. Soviet bases in Cuba would have been destroyed. Soviet personnel would have been killed. Khrushchev would have faced his own pressures, his own military advisors, his own domestic politics, his own protocols. The Soviet Union doesn't back down from direct attacks on its forces. It can't. The entire logic of superpower deterrence collapses if you let an attack go unanswered. So, Soviet bombers would have launched. Or Soviet missiles. Or both. American cities would have been targeted. Washington, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. Not as threats, as actual targets. With actual warheads, with actual launch codes being entered into actual systems by actual people following actual orders. The United States would have responded. It would have had to respond. The entire arsenal. Strategic Air Command bombers. Minuteman missiles. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Every weapon aimed at every Soviet city. Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, Stalingrad. The industrial centers, the population centers, the military centers. Everything. The exchanges would have happened fast. Minutes, not hours. The missiles fly faster than diplomacy. Faster than second thoughts. Faster than anyone realizing this isn't what anyone actually wanted. This is just what the systems required, what the protocols demanded. What the logic of nuclear deterrence made inevitable once someone crossed the threshold. Hundreds of millions dead in the first hours. The cities gone, the infrastructure destroyed, the governments decapitated. Then the aftermath, the radiation, the fallout, the nuclear winter, the agricultural collapse, the starvation, the disease, the breakdown of whatever remained of civilization. All of it starting with one torpedo, 10 to 15 kilotons, similar to Hiroshima, launched from a submarine that thought it was already under attack, launched by officers who believed they were fighting a war that had already started, launched under protocols that made perfect sense given the information available, launched with full authorization from 2 out of 3 required officers, not launched only as one man said no. One man who wasn't even technically required to be consulted. One man whose vote shouldn't have counted. One man who somehow convinced 2 other men, in the worst conditions imaginable, in a moment of maximum stress and minimum information, to wait, to hesitate, to doubt. That's how close it was. Not theoretically could have escalated, not might have led to conflict, was seconds away from happening. The torpedo was ready. The target was identified. The authorization was given. The only thing standing between that moment and global nuclear war was Arkhipav's uncertainty. His willingness to say, "I'm not sure." His willingness to admit he didn't know if the war had started. His willingness to bet everything on doubt rather than certainty. Which raises another question. How many other times did we come this close? The Cuban Missile Crisis is the one we know about. The one that got declassified. The one where survivors eventually talked. The one where historians eventually reconstructed what happened. How many other moments occurred where we don't know the details? Where the records are still classified, where the participants died without talking, where sheer luck prevented catastrophe and nobody ever found out. The nuclear age is 75 years old. Thousands of weapons have been built. Hundreds of thousands of people have worked with them. Tens of thousands of situations have occurred where the weapons were on alert, where protocols were activated, where decisions were made under pressure and uncertainty. How many Archipovs have there been? How many times has one person's doubt, one person's hesitation, one person's willingness to violate protocol or question orders or demand verification prevented a launch that would have started the cascade? We don't know. We can't know. The nature of the problem is that successful prevention doesn't leave evidence. The times when someone says, "Wait, let's verify this," and it turns out to be a false alarm, don't make it into the history books. They don't get conferences 40 years later. They don't get investigated by journalists. They just fade into classified files and forgotten memories. Which means we might owe our existence to dozens of people whose names we'll never know, who made decisions we'll never hear about, who chose doubt over certainty in moments of crisis we'll never understand, who violated protocols we'll never read, who questioned orders we'll never see, who hesitated when the systems told them to act. That's a terrifying way to survive. Dependent on individual judgment in systems designed to minimize individual judgment. Dependent on human doubt in systems designed to eliminate human doubt. Dependent on protocol violations in systems designed to enforce absolute protocol compliance. The entire architecture of nuclear deterrence assumes certainty, automatic response, guaranteed retaliation. The logic only works if everyone believes the weapons will be used as specified. If everyone believes the protocols will be followed. If everyone believes that an attack will be met with overwhelming force without hesitation or doubt. Arkhipov broke that logic. He hesitated when the logic said, "Don't hesitate." He doubted when the logic said, "Don't doubt." He questioned when the logic said, "Don't question." He did exactly what nuclear deterrence theory says you should never do. He saved everyone by doing it, which suggests the theory is wrong. Not wrong about deterrence preventing war under normal circumstances. Wrong about what happens when deterrence fails. Wrong about what should happen in the moment when all the careful planning and protocol design and strategic thinking collides with reality. Wrong about whether certainty or doubt is more dangerous when you're 300 feet underwater, in a metal tube with no communications and no verification, and 2 other officers screaming at you to launch. In that moment, the theory says, launch. The theory says you can't afford to wait. The theory says if you're under attack, then waiting means dying for nothing. The theory says uncertainty is the enemy. The theory says the only way to survive is to retaliate immediately with maximum force. Arkhipov ignored the theory. He chose uncertainty. He chose waiting. He chose doubt. The theory was wrong. We're still here to argue about it as he ignored the theory. If he'd followed the theory, if he'd chosen certainty, if he'd voted yes, none of us would be here. The theory would have killed us all. Doubt saved us. That's the real paradox. Nuclear weapons are built on certainty, designed for certainty, deployed for certainty. The deterrence logic requires certainty. The strategic calculations assume certainty. The protocols enforce certainty. Everything about nuclear weapons is designed to eliminate doubt, to remove hesitation, to ensure that when the moment comes, the response is automatic and overwhelming and certain. And yet the only thing that prevented them from being used, in the moment when everything said to use them, was doubt. Not strategic doubt, not calculated doubt, not the kind of doubt that comes from careful analysis and risk assessment and game theory. The kind of doubt that comes from saying, I don't actually know what's happening. I don't actually know if the war has started. I don't actually know if this is the right decision. I'm not actually certain. Arkhipov wasn't making a strategic calculation. He was admitting ignorance. He was acknowledging uncertainty. He was confessing doubt. In a system built to eliminate all 3. That's what saved us, which means every minute we've survived since then has been a gift of doubt. Every hour that's passed without nuclear war has been possible only through moments when someone, somewhere, chose uncertainty over certainty. When someone hesitated. When someone questioned, when someone said, wait, let me verify, or hold on, let me check, or I'm not sure, let's confirm. The weapons remain, the protocols remain, the systems remain, the logic of deterrence remains. Everything that was true on October 27, 1962 is still true today. Submarines still patrol with nuclear weapons. Officers still have pre-delegated authority. Situations still arise where communications fail and information is incomplete and decisions must be made under pressure. The difference is we know the story now. We know what almost happened. We know how close it came. We know that one man's doubt in one moment prevented global catastrophe. Does that make us safer? Does knowing the story change anything? Does understanding how fragile the system is, how dependent on individual judgment, how reliant on people choosing doubt over certainty, does that knowledge make the world more secure or less? It should make us more careful. It should make us question the logic of deterrence. It should make us rethink whether building weapons designed for certainty is wise when survival depends on doubt. It should make us consider whether systems that eliminate human judgment are actually more dangerous than systems that preserve it. It should. Whether it does is another question. The weapons remain. More weapons than in 1962. More sophisticated weapons. More accurate weapons. Weapons with shorter flight times, and faster targeting, and better communications, and more automation. Everything designed to be more certain. more reliable, more automatic, more trustworthy. Everything designed to eliminate the possibility of another Arkhipov. Another moment where someone can say no. Another situation where doubt can outweigh certainty. Another human decision point where uncertainty can prevent catastrophe. We're making the systems more certain. The history says we should be making them more doubtful. We're removing human judgment. The history says human judgment is what saved us. We're automating decisions. The history says the automated decision would have killed everyone. We're learning exactly the wrong lesson. Or maybe we're learning the right lesson and ignoring it. Maybe we understand that Arkhipov saved us by violating the logic of deterrence. Maybe we recognize that doubt prevented catastrophe. Maybe we acknowledge that certainty would have killed us all. And maybe we've decided that the risk of another close call is acceptable compared to the risk of appearing weak or uncertain or hesitant. Maybe we've concluded that even though doubt saved us once, we can't build systems around doubt. We can't write protocols that require hesitation. We can't design weapons that encourage questioning. We can't create command structures that value uncertainty, not while maintaining deterrence, not while keeping adversaries convinced that retaliation is certain and overwhelming and automatic. So we pretend. We pretend the systems are certain. We pretend the protocols are absolute. We pretend the decisions are automatic. We pretend that in the moment of crisis, everything will work exactly as designed. We maintain the facade of certainty while hoping that when the moment comes, if it comes, someone like Arkhipov will be there. Someone who will doubt. Someone who will hesitate. Someone who will choose uncertainty over certainty. Someone who will violate the protocols and question the orders and demand verification and say, no, we're depending on protocol violations to save us. We're relying on system failures. We're hoping for human error. The kind of human error where someone fails to follow the certainty-based logic and instead chooses doubt-based reasoning. That's an insane way to manage existential risk. And yet, that's where we are. That's where we've been for 75 years. That's where we'll continue to be until something changes. Either the weapons or the logic or the systems or the willingness to accept that doubt, not certainty, is what keeps us alive. October 27, 1962 should have taught us that. Vasily Arkhipov should have taught us that. The story of B-59 should have taught us that. The fact that we're only here to tell the story as one man chose uncertainty should have taught us that. We haven't learned it. We're still building certainty into systems that nearly killed us. We're still eliminating doubt from protocols that almost ended humanity. We're still designing for automation when human hesitation is what saved everyone. Maybe we'll get lucky again. Maybe the next crisis will have another Arkhipov. Maybe the next moment of maximum danger will include someone willing to choose doubt over certainty. Maybe the next submarine or silo or command center will have the right person in the right position with the right credibility and the right willingness to say no. Maybe. That's a lot of maybes, a lot of luck, a lot of dependence on individual humans making the right choice in impossible circumstances with incomplete information and maximum pressure and minimum time. That's what we're betting civilization on. That's what we're risking humanity for. That's what we're gambling with every day. The weapons remain ready, and the protocols remain active, and the systems remain designed for certainty rather than doubt. Arkhipov bet everything on doubt. We're betting everything on getting lucky again. His bet paid off. Will ours? That's the question we should be asking. That's the lesson we should be learning. That's the change we should be making. We should be designing systems that value doubt, that require hesitation, that enforce verification, that make saying no as easy as saying yes, that reward uncertainty rather than punishing it, that recognize doubt as strength rather than weakness. We should be building Arkhipov into the protocols, making his choice the default, ensuring that in moments of crisis, the system requires doubt rather than eliminating it, creating structure that protects the one person saying, "Wait, I'm not sure," rather than empowering the two people saying, "Launch immediately." We're doing the opposite. Every improvement makes certainty more certain. Every upgrade makes automation more automatic. Every enhancement makes the system faster and more reliable and less dependent on human judgment. We're engineering out the possibility of another Arkhipov. We're designing away the thing that saved us. Unless something changes, unless we recognize what actually happened on October 27, 1962, unless we understand that the story isn't everything worked as planned. The story is everything would have killed us if one person hadn't violated the plan. Unless we accept that doubt saved us and certainty would have ended us. Unless we're willing to rebuild the systems around that truth rather than around the comfortable fiction that certainty equals safety. Which brings us back, one final time, to that moment. October 27, 1962. 300 feet below the surface. Inside a metal tube. 3 men. 1 torpedo. 2 voting yes. 1 voting no. The no winning not through protocol but through doubt. Not through certainty but through uncertainty. Not through following the rules but through questioning them. 3 men voting. 2 saying yes. 1 saying no. The no wins. It wins through doubt. It wins through uncertainty. It wins through one man's willingness to say, "I'm not sure," when everyone else was certain. It wins through one man's courage to choose ignorance over knowledge, hesitation over action, waiting over launching. It wins through one man admitting he didn't know when the systems required him to know, when the protocols required him to decide, when the logic required him to be certain. He wasn't certain. He admitted it. He chose doubt. The world survived. That's the story. That's the lesson. That's what October 27, 1962 should teach us. Doubt saves us. Certainty kills us. Uncertainty is strength. Hesitation is wisdom. Admitting ignorance is courage. Choosing to wait is choosing life. Vasily Arkhipov understood that. In a moment when it mattered more than any moment before or since. In a decision that determined whether humanity continued or ended. In circumstances that should have led to certainty and instead led to doubt. He chose doubt. We're here as he did. We'll continue to be here only if we learn from what he did. Only if we understand why it worked. Only if we build that understanding into our systems rather than engineering it out. Only if we recognize that the uncomfortable truth of nuclear weapons isn't that certainty keeps us safe. It's that doubt is the only thing that ever kept us alive.